You are listening to Nerd Best Friends, a podcast that covers the nerdy conversations you're already having, or wish you could. It's the nerdiest thing you'll do this week.
Welcome back to another episode of Nerd Best Friends. I am Analese, and I'm here with my best friend, Rob.
Hey, it's me, Rob, your best friend, your super nerd, and your podcast host.
Nerd Best Friends can be found wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe and follow us now. Support our podcast by clicking subscribe or follow on your device, or find us on Patreon or Venmo for more support options. This is episode 47, and today we are talking about the man known as the master of horror and the scary multiverse created by none other than Stephen King. I'm so excited for this episode.
And I'm going to sit and listen.
But first, what I like about it.
For this episode's What I Like About It, I want to clue everybody in to a podcast. This is the Marvel Wastelands podcast. And what this is audio dramas within the Marvel universe. And it's not just like comic books being read aloud. This is a future post-apocalyptic world that's been created that really fits in with the Old Man Logan comic books, if you remember those, or if that's something you read. Old Man Logan took place in just this desolated North America where long time had gone by. Dr. Doom had taken over the world. Galactus had destroyed a bunch of things. Most of the superheroes that were mortal had passed away, and only the ones with healing factors and stuff, like the grizzled Wolverine or the Hulk or, things like that were still around. And as they took this cross-country trip across America, looking at all the horrible things that had happened in the Marvel universe, it unraveled this story of how it happened and those kinds of things. So the Wastelands podcast takes place in that kind of post-apocalyptic Marvel universe, and each season focuses on a different hero. So I think there was Marvel Wasteland Wolverine, and then there was Marvel Wastelands Black Widow, and then there was Marvel Wastelands Rocket Raccoon and Star-Lord, and there was Marvel Wastelands, I think there was definitely a Squirrel Girl one, but I don't know if that was something different. But they're all on the same feed, and they're really cool. They have excellent voice acting, right? It's not like an audiobook. It's definitely like a full-blown audio drama with great voice actors and sound effects and all that kind of stuff. And it takes place in the Marvel universe, and they're episodic. So it kind of, they do a good job of releasing little bit by little bit the story and backstory as far as world building for this kind of alternate universe or this multiverse in Marvel. I hadn't heard of it. It was a little bit buried because what they do is, I think they're from, is it iHeart Radio? They're exclusive to one of the podcast carriers.
Only one.
Yes. So
okay.
I might be iHeart. So when it comes out, you can only listen to it on iHeart. And then when it's done, they'll release it out to everybody.
No, that's
right?
Interesting.
But as far as all the marketing and stuff, it's on some podcatcher that I don't use. So by the time I heard about it, there were 3 or 4 of these seasons that are done, and I'll go through and I listen to them like an audiobook, right? Just in a big chunk kind of as I go through, my week or my month or whatever it might be. But you can find them. If you search for Wastelands in your podcatcher of choice, you'll see all the different titles and stuff that they came up with. I think the last one I listened to was Marvel Wastelands Dr. Doom. Yeah, it's pretty fun. So, and it was not on my radar at all until somebody word of mouth told me about it. So now I'm word of mouth telling you about it.
Look at that. And that actually sounds a lot more interesting than what I thought about when I read the title Marvel Wastelands podcast. I thought, wow, are they going to talk about all the goop and goop and goop that MCU keeps coming out with so that I don't have to watch it?
No, it has nothing to do with any of that.
No, actually, it sounds really interesting. That's a good catch.
Yeah, I liked it. And it's just a different, I don't have a lot of podcasts I listen to that are audio dramas like that. So it's nice to have this kind of free episodic thing that obviously has a high production value and sounds real good.
Right on. Well, let's get to some nerd mail.
Nerd mail.
So we had a question from a newer listener about our 2024 nerd goals. And I think we mentioned it somewhere in the episode about how we put it together with the cards on Trello. But
we did, but if you hadn't listened to, say, like the season 1 Trello episode, 2022 or whatever that one was, we didn't go into it in that kind of detail.
Yeah. So we use Trello and we create a card for each goal, and depending on how you do it, I know I mentioned how I have my list of 24, and then I have a wish list of things that I add on throughout the year that maybe I switch in and out. I number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 24 so that I can keep numerical order of them on the different cards. And I know you were playing with how you were going to do that, so you just didn't have a long list.
Right. So last year I had done it by quarters to try to, try to inspire me, like, oh, here's these things I'm going to put, these projects I want to do on quarter 1 and see how I do. It didn't really work out that well for me. So this year I'm back to a real simple, I've got one list that is ideas, one list that is in progress, one list that is mission accomplished. However, I did mention doing some things differently. So what I'm playing around with this year, and it seems to be going well, is I have some additional lists after that for the things that, like, I want to do 24 times. So for instance, I want to walk from my house down to the beach before, like, get up early before work, watch the sunrise over the beach 24 times this year. Yeah. And so I started a separate list for that because I want to take a picture of that sunrise every time and have a big list full of images, that's kind of inspiring and like, oh, wow, look at all these cool sunrises and things that I took a picture of. So I did add some different lists on there for things like that I wanted to document just a little bit more visually than on one card. Because I could do that with the card, but I can't see them all unless I do a couple more clicks into the card, that kind of thing. Same thing with some of the miniature painting. It's like, oh, well, I know I'm going to do this big project and paint 1,300 miniatures for this thing. So I might make its own list so I can see the pictures all at a glance and watch them like really stack up on the accomplishments board.
I know we also talked about in the past about how a lot of people use Trello for work and they don't really want to go back on Trello. And so really just use, listeners, whatever you want. My twist this year is I actually have a handwritten list. And that's because I forget to go onto the Trello app on my phone. Like, I try to come home and get off my phone for a few hours.
Sure.
Because I may have been on it throughout the day during work and whatnot. So I'm going to keep my handwritten list. And then once in a while, maybe once a week, go and dump the info into Trello and track my progress that way. So that's my little twist. I kind of went backwards to some good old pen and paper, but it really
and is it just a straight up pad of paper, or do you have like a journal or something that you came up with?
I have a journal, but I don't know if I'm going to put my Trello stuff on there yet. That's really just, I'm kind of every few days as a new principal, every few days, I'm just kind of writing through to just express and think through and do that. But right now it's just a sheet of paper in which I'm doing little hash marks. 1, 2, 3, 4 hash, 1, 2, 3, 4 hash. And then if I need little notes next to it, I'm putting little, like, there's notes kind of, it's messy. It's a little all over the place. But as I've spent winter break setting up the nerd room in a little bit more finality, putting up some shelves, and I got a special little bookshelf that looks like a little tree for the books I'm reading right now, so they're not just
is that what that is?
I'll put a picture of it on our Instagram, but it's the books I'm reading now. That was just a stack on my nightstand that just was always this giant stack. I didn't get through my Goodreads goal last year because I've never been like a little bit in this book, a little bit in that book. So now I have them all there. I can take one, read it, put it back, and I don't have this stack that just looks menacing on my nightstand anymore. One of the things I want to put up now that I see the wall space as it is like a half whiteboard, white erase board, bulletin board. And I think I'm going to track my 24 on there until I put it on Trello, erase it and update it and stuff.
Have you seen the whiteboards that are black?
Yes.
They're like black. God, they're so cool.
They're really cool.
I got one for the office.
Did you?
Because I thought it was so cool. You have to use like a different kind of pen. Yeah. So that it pops, but man, it looks good.
Yeah, those things are really cool.
I was going to say, if you're going to put one in your nerd room, get the cool black glass one.
Yeah, you might have convinced me of that because I forgot about them. But yeah, that's kind of my next step. But the twist for me is that going back to some sort of visual every day instead of, I could go months and not open up that Trello app. and then go, oh, I didn't log all these things. It's the same thing with the board game stats. And I have to go back through my calendar and say, oh yeah, we played on this day, we played on this day, we played on this day. So
I've got a pretty good habit of that. Also, but I'm not very good about closing tabs on my computer. So a lot of times when I'm like clicking through, I'm like, oh, there's Trello. Let's see how we doing.
You make a good point. I've never opened it on my computer at work. Maybe just having it open.
I mean, the computer version where you can see everything spread out and everything on your monitor.
I double screen. Yeah. So to our newer listeners, Trello is the go-to for us, but use whatever you want. Track your nerd goals. Share it with us. It's Stephen King time.
I know you've been real excited about this. I'm going to be pretty positive on it too. But Stephen King is not something that I have ever been into. I feel like I'm very aware of Stephen King. Stephen King is one of those on my list, like The Wheel of Time or like Discworld or things like that, where it's like, I know about them. I know they're hugely famous. I know they have 1 million books and are bestsellers, but we can't be into everything, I guess. And that's just not one that I am. But it is fun. We're going to come at it at a fun angle as far as talking about the multiverse is the rage this year. Everybody's got to have a multiverse. The Marvel universe has to have a multiverse. They got to put a Flash movie in there and make a multiverse. Everything's a multiverse. So we're going to talk about really that shared universe that the Stephen King novels have, and just let you nerd out about it.
I will say, end of our episode notes, we have an area on recommendations. Knowing what I know about you as my best friend, you are not a horror genre person. You don't like horror movies. You don't like scary things. So it makes sense that you would not have really read a lot of Stephen King. But most people in that realm are surprised to find you're actually a big fan of Stephen King, because his words have creeped out in places that aren't attributed to horror. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, but he's also done some work in other genres. One of his most recent, I'll say in the last 10 years, he's written some like true crime detective, like old pulp type novels,
like noir pulp stuff.
Yeah, but settled in modern times. But that genre, at least, right? He has a couple of forays into fantasy, and one of them I gave to Andrew, I think last year as a Christmas gift. It was called Eyes of the Dragon, which he wrote when his daughter was young teenage, and saying like, I can't read anything you write, so I dare you to write something that I can read. So he writes this dragon-based fantasy novel. It's okay, and it's not horror like you think of Carrie and It and The Shining. Sure. It's not that. He also has a newer one called Fairy Tale that is very high fantasy based. I think you would enjoy it a lot. And it's got suspense, but it doesn't have like clown in the gutter in the sewers,
gore,
right? Like
terrible child endangerment things.
Exactly. So there's a lot to him, and what I have learned being such a big fan of his ever since I was 12 when I read my first Stephen King, and I will say it was probably too young, but I was always an avid reader. My parents just let me read.
I just saw a meme about that, like on some place where it was like, I think Gen X can be summarized by, I read Stephen King too young and now this is how I am.
I was totally going to bring that up. Like, I think the meme says something like, Gen X feels like people who read Stephen King at a young age, and that's why they are the way they are, or something like that. I'm like, who's attacking me? Why are you attacking me? Which it's 100% true. Over the course of all these decades of him writing, he's been writing since the 60s. He's been published as an author since the 70s. All these decades, he's created this multiverse. And we've actually had a few episodes talking about multiverses lots of times this season. It felt like the right time to bring up Stephen King. So before we go to Stephen King's multiverse, I see you have some notes about multiverses in general.
Yeah, so we were talking earlier about how popular the multiverse is in all of these everybody's got to have a multiverse. I mean, I think probably, one of the earliest multiverses I remember would be like Star Trek, right? The episode where they meet Spock with a goatee because he's evil Spock. Things like that, was super funny. So the idea being that these universes coexist, right? And each universe can be different. There's different versions of characters, or there's different versions of the world itself. I think when we look at a movie like Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, as they're jumping through the multiverse, they do a great visual explanation of like what's possible in a multiverse. This one's a cartoon. This one's paint. This one's walking and talking taco people. Like it could be anything, right? Which is a little off the rails, but a lot of times we have that idea of like a what if scenario, or, you know, how would this have been different if something had happened wrong? It connects a lot to our Quantum Leap episode, right? With the idea
I was just
of,
thinking about that too, yeah.
well, this is what happened in history, but what if it happened like this? We could create this divergent timeline. We think about Back to the Future 2, where Doc Brown does a good job explaining it on the chalkboard, which is like, this is our path from 1955 to 1985, but you changed this thing, and now we have another timeline, you know, of what happened there. Marvel and DC do this all the time. They even came out with, you know, Marvel for a long time had a comic book line called What If? And every month there would be these what if stories of, you know, what if Aunt May had gotten bit by the radioactive spider? You know, what if Peggy Carter had gotten the super soldier serum instead of Steve Rogers? All those kinds of things. And just tell these stories of like, this is how the Marvel universe could be. And then, of course, we mentioned Star Trek, one of the go-to tropes, right? It's like, oh, put a goatee on it. That's the version from an alternate evil universe kind of thing. But it allows writers to explore different things, right? There's definitely the idea of, well, if something's getting stale, we're telling the same old stories. Let's put them in a multiverse. You know, what if this had happened differently? And just tell a different story with familiar characters and kind of those plot twists, right? And it also helps, like, I've got this Spider-Man story. I've got this Superman story that I really want to tell, but it's going to screw everything up. Because in mine, Jimmy Olsen turns evil and kills Lois Lane or whatever. It's like, well, you can't upset the apple cart. But if we do an alternate universe, if we put a what if tag on it, you can tell those stories. We really enjoyed, what was the one? Injustice. Right?
Oh, yeah.
What a fun time Injustice is, but it's like, it's not the main canon of the DC universe. It's a multiverse version. Like in this universe, everything went crazy. And then it's also a way to kind of soft boot things in as far as like, oh, I wonder if the audience will bear this, because there are definitely times where we've seen things that are supposed to be multiverse, things that are supposed to be these what if stories will come back into the main universe if they're popular enough and if people really like them. So it's a way to kind of soft launch things as well.
Yeah. And we even talked about it last episode with the Audible Buffy book, creating that multiverse idea of, you know, a universe where Buffy doesn't exist and a universe where she never comes to Sunnydale and so on and so on. So to cycle it back around, we're talking about Stephen King and a multiverse. So there's actually two kind of prongs to this. And the first is the fact that he's just written so many books, and he centers majority of them in Maine, where he's from, and a fictional town called Castle Rock. So there's actually the show on Hulu called Castle Rock that is loosely based on things that crisscross in and out of this fictional town.
I have a question for you right away.
Okay.
H.P. Lovecraft was another horror writer, and all of his stories took place in like in the New England area with like Miskatonic and Innismith and like all of that stuff happens there. Do you think there's an homage there to that idea?
I don't know that he's ever directly said so, but I would be very surprised if it wasn't. If there's one thing I admire about Stephen King is that he is not only very well read, he has continued to be well read in all these decades where he could have just created, but he knows a lot about the genre. He knows a lot about horror writers. He just knows and reads 100%. There's got to be some sort of connection to creating these fictional towns in Maine. And then actually using real ones, like Portland, Maine, is mentioned in a few books. But it's really brilliant. And, you know, it's almost like a gotcha, like a hook to a song, right? Because since very early novels, he'll write a preface in his books to which he writes them to constant reader. Dear constant reader, the story you're about to read, and sometimes it's a preface and sometimes it's at the end of the book where he tells a little story like, this story would not have been possible without the research help of blah, blah, blah. And thanks to these people and constant reader, thank you to you too. Like he called his fans from a very early, like that's a little hook, right?
Okay. Gotcha.
All right.
Gotcha.
So then all of a sudden you're reading one story and they bring in a character or a reference, or, oh, when that dog Cujo went crazy and the town over did this. He has all of those connections to where you're like, I know about that because I read your other books. It's a little it's a little hook, right? And I will tell you the reason why I bring this up is because I remember the exact moment that I got hooked, right? I read Four Past Midnight when I was 12 years old. And when I was like, I don't know, 17, where I could have went any direction with the fandom and reading his books, he publishes Needful Things. And I remember it being billed as the last Castle Rock story. And spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert to anyone who's listening, Needful Things ends kind of the way Buffy ends, with Castle Rock exploding, imploding. Okay. Right. It was a huge thing. They made a movie out of it. I remember reading it and loving that book. Ace Merrill, Ace Merrill because you've seen Stand By Me. Ace Merrill is a Keith Sutherland, older guy bully. He makes an appearance in Needful Things. You know who he is. And when it references his past, like he came back to Castle Rock because he used to be, kids would run in fear when they saw him on the street and and you find out what's happened to him and he comes back and he's in Needful Things. Shawshank Redemption. The novella is called Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption. And I know you love that movie. So that's when I say I do.
That's, the greatest dad movie ever made. There's nothing like Shawshank Redemption coming on the TV on a Sunday afternoon and taking a dad nap in your recliner.
100%. And you wake up to Andy crawling
arms
through
akimbo.
3 football fields because that's the symphonic swell in that moment when he has his arms up. That always wakes me up. Anyways, Shawshank as a prison is brought up in other books. This guy, I heard he did a few years at Shawshank and that's his universe. And it is so complex. I know I sent you the visual of this, of all the different references and all that. It's huge. We'll put it up on our Patreon newsletter so that anyone interested you gotta zoom in and see this is referenced here. And that's it is so deep. Then you get to him writing The Dark Tower. And he writes The Dark Tower in I think the first one's early 80s, if not 1980 exactly. He writes it
that's older
pretty early in his career. All of a sudden he's created a multiverse. And you have to get into the Dark Tower series in its totality to learn about these different lands that these 2 main characters exist in, and then they appear in other novels, creating this multiverse. There's a priest character that has a little bit of a redemption track in another novel. In Salem's Lot has another redemption track. Something good happens to this poor guy who gets just trashed in the Dark Tower series. So
how do they jump between worlds? Is that ever explained? Is there a magic portal? Is there a time travel? Is there when you die you go to Earth 1? How do they breach the rift barrier to get there?
I don't know that it's ever really explained. I don't know. And part of my don't know is because I haven't actually finished the Dark Tower series. I profess myself as a huge fan of Stephen King. I've read everything except the Dark Tower series. And I know I've talked about that earlier in the podcast. It was one of my nerdiest things, I think, that I finished Dark Tower 1. So I'm reading the other ones and learning about the multiverse itself. And I can get back to you on the answer to that question.
Okay, no problem.
Realistically, I don't know that he ever does, and I don't know that he ever needs to, because the characters in Dark Tower are on that, quest path themselves, Lord of the Rings type journey themselves.
Because in the time travel one, right, they go into a closet and it's like the Schiffer Road to Narnia or whatever. You close the door and then you're back in the 1960s.
Right. So in individual novels, he'll talk about it that way. But in terms of this entire big universe, I don't know if he set out and buffed all that out, that this is going to go here and this is the parallel to this and or if when he's writing each individual novel, here's the opportunity to, what if I bring this character back? What if he could have picked any bad guy who's into bad things to be in Needful Things at the end, but he brings Ace Merrill back. Was that on purpose? Or was that just, hey, here's an opportunity to bring this character in? I don't know. I don't know, but it's brought out in different bits and pieces throughout all of these novels. So I think the best way to kind of go about the answer to your question there is to talk very briefly on what I kind of saw this online, but define Stephen King's writing in 3 eras. And this is important because he's mostly known for his first era. This is where he writes all the hard, terrifying horror stuff. Right. I consider Era 1, his first book is published in 1974. That's Carrie. And I'm actually really like, read the story about how this novel was published. It's not a front to back, you're reading a story. One chapter you're reading an excerpt from a news article. The next one you're reading court records of the trial after all the bad stuff happened. And then like, it's a very unusual novel. But it's published. It's super popular. We know the movie came out in the early 80s, starring Sissy Spacek, and it's one of the iconic horror movies of all time. But this era, through 1989, he writes Salem's Lot, The Shining, Cujo, It, Misery. Like, this is the stuff that he's really, really known for in the horror genre.
Remind me, which one is Salem's Lot?
Salem's Lot is vampires.
Oh, okay.
And Salem's Lot is next to Castle Rock. It's a city near Castle Rock in Maine. And actually, Salem's Lot has a lot to do with the Dark Tower. There's some character and there's some multiverse action between those two, but I don't remember in Salem's Lot if it's ever explained. Dark Tower does kind of get there. And then in some ways there's just a character appearance. Like it's really interesting how he does it. But Salem's Lot is basically vampires. The Shining, we all know The Shining, Haunted Hotel. Yep. The Stand is a really long novel that's also kind of a prelude or preclude, if you will, to the Dark Tower series. Some actually call it read that before you start the Dark Tower series because there's some connection, universe connection, multiverse connection there. He writes the Bachman books, which he gets to a point that he's so popular in the 80s. People are like, oh yeah, that's Stephen King. He can publish his laundry list and it would be a bestseller. And so he writes under a pseudonym. And he writes these 4 books called the Bachman books. They are actually out of print now because there is one in there called Rage, in which a high school kid takes his class hostage via guns. And there was a school shooter sometime in the early 90s that had a copy of Rage all highlighted and written in and stuff like that. And it affected Stephen King so much he actually pulled it. You can't really get the Bachman books anymore. But there are a couple that actually, I think they're making a movie out of one of them now, and that is called The Long Walk. And it's a dystopian competition like Hunger Games, only they have to walk. There's 100, you get picked randomly and different sections of the
yeah, I think I read about that one.
Yeah, and I think they're making a movie out of it now. It's an excellent book. The Running Man was a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh yeah, with Arnold Schwarzenegger. That movie's great.
Yep. That's also a Bachman book. So, see, like you are Stephen King fan. You just didn't know it. So in this era where he writes this really demented horror, Stephen King has mentioned this is an era in which he was either drunk on coke, on some sort of pills, and combination of all 3, not sleeping, where he wrote a lot of this horror. In fact, there's an interview I found where he said he doesn't remember writing Cujo. He doesn't remember it at all. So this is an era where his writing really reflects what he was going through.
They say they say that about a lot of the movies too, like some of the like silly pants ones where with the movies was like, it was just such a cocaine fest back there that like, it's amazing those movies ever got done. Like there's, what's the one with all the machines and there's like the semi truck with the Green Goblin on the front. All the machines come alive in the little diner and everybody's trapped in there.
I don't remember the name of it.
Maximum Overdrive? Is that what that was?
That was, okay. So then he has stuff like that. Yes. Right. So there's not much to the story, but then they try to extract it out. And,
I've heard the making of those movies were just buck wild drug fests.
Yeah. I would not be surprised. There's a lot there. We could do a whole other episode about the adaptations to screen on his stuff. There's some stuff that's really good. He actually dislikes The Shining, which is also one of the like top horror movies ever made, but he doesn't like what Stanley Kubrick did to the ending. It's totally different than the book. It's totally different. So like, there's a lot to be said about that. But yeah, I look at a lot of the things that they made into movies and TV and go, why? There's a book, a book called Thinner about a dude who gets cursed by a gypsy woman. And he's like this big, fat, 500-pound dude, and he does something stupid. He gets cursed by a gypsy woman, and no matter how much he eats, he gets thinner until he's supposed to, skin and bones. He's going to die from it if he doesn't find a way to reverse this curse. Like, why would you? It was not a good movie. It was an okay book. It was interesting. It was a thriller. Is he going to survive this? Does he deserve to survive it? Like, and I will say for Stephen King's credit, one of the reasons why I love reading his books so much is that he does a really good job of getting you to care about characters very quickly. You get pulled in.
Okay.
And when he's writing as an 11-year-old boy or a 14-year-old girl, he does the work to make you believe that voice is that 11-year-old boy. I admire that a lot more that I'm older now and can see and hear the different tones in the different characters throughout his books. And so he ends this era and starts to get sober, and we hit 1990, and this is where he writes some of his less, it's still horror genre, but not crazy scary like It and Salem's Lot and The Shining. This is where he writes Needful Things. He writes The Green Mile. He writes a story called Bag of Bones, which really has a lot to do more with like the paranormal, like ghosts. And it's scary because you have this guy who is basically being haunted by a ghost, and he's got to figure out this thing. And Hearts in Atlantis is another novella series that has to do with the Vietnam War and a character that was a teen, went to the war, and these different phases of life. So nearly everything in this era, he really starts honing in on this multiverse.
This is more of a world building, creepy
Yes.
things. This is how these kinds of things work and affect people.
Yes.
But it's not a very personal, like this person is being terrorized and ripped apart and scary stuff, right?
It gets into psychological, it gets into the cause and effect, it gets into the human nature of things. Needful Things is that. And I'm bringing that up a few times because one of my Trello 24 for 24 is that I want to reread 2 + 4, 6 Stephen King novels that I read when I was a teen and haven't gone back to. And I say reread with quotation marks because I'm doing audiobooks. And I remember just loving Needful Things. I remember being so excited and for the movie to come out and seeing the trailer and standing in line opening night to go see it at Fiesta 5 in Santa Barbara. Like, I remember just being excited about it. I barely remember anything about it. So I put it on my Trello board for that reason. But Needful Things is about human nature and wanting things that you can't afford or can't have or shouldn't have, that you dream about. What would you do? What price would you pay for the thing that you love the most? It's creepy. It's got scariness to it, but it's not Cujo terrorizing a town, and it's not, I was going to say Jack Tripper, but that's the wrong Jack.
That was him in the movie. That was him in it, right? John Ritter?
Yeah, John. Hey, he would have been a creepy dude. John Ritter, bless his heart, rest his soul. He's such a nice guy. It's not Annie Wilkes holding hostage and breaking the legs of her favorite writer, so he'll write the book that she wants to. I mean, it's psychological horror at this point, and multiverse building and universe building. I will also say this is, I think, kind of a start of him delving more into sci-fi. He writes an episode or two for X-Files, and they're pretty popular. I think that helps, I see it help lead into the final era, which starts about 2005. And the reason why I see it starting about 2005 is because near the end of the 90s, early 2000s, Stephen King is on a walk and is hit by a car, and it's near fatal.
Now,
and
I know as a big turning point in his life and career. Right.
Yes.
To the point where it's even included in the novels, right?
Yes. And in fact, if you get newer published versions of The Dark Tower, the first one, he's got a dozen or so pages on how that wreck made him realize it was a mistake to not finish the Dark Tower series. He was never going to. He was going to leave it an open-ended story, and how it made him go if I had died, all of these constant readers will never get this closure, even though I can see where it's going. I wasn't ever planning on doing it. So he goes through and cleans up the novels. And I say cleans up, he doesn't George Lucas it, where he throws in elements. What he does is take out things that were acceptable being written in 1980 that would not be acceptable printed now. So he cleans up the Dark Tower series and then writes the final few books after this. And I will say the books that have come after that are also very, very different. He completes Dark Tower. That's still a bit of that horror suspense fantasy genre. He writes Dr. Sleep, which is a epilogue to The Shining, where it follows the little boy, Red Rum. It follows him. And so that one's scary, but it's psychological horror. He writes these detective novels. He writes a short story called Blockade Billy, which is about this baseball player. And it's got a Stephen King twist to it. It's bloody and gross, but it's not not a clown in the gutter luring little kids. He writes 11/22/63. He writes this trilogy of books that starts with Mr. Mercedes and follows Bill Hodges, who's like a retired police officer. And from that trilogy, he writes The Outsider, The Institute, and Holly, which now include, here's that universe building. He has his character named Holly that he's now gotten to the point where she got her own standalone book, started as a minute character in Mr. Mercedes. So he's writing these thrillers and sci-fi and high fantasy after that car accident.
Now, I did have a question as we were going through. It occurred to me, but you talked about some episodes of the X-Files that were written by Stephen King. Did Stephen King write the Quantum Leap episode that Stephen King is in?
Oh, that's a good question. He might have, because that is a thing for him to he's like Stan Lee, right? He's got a cameo and he's got cameos in like nearly everything, but let's look that up. That's a good one.
Stephen King became a Quantum Leap character. I remember that, but did he write it? Quantum Leap, The Boogeyman, October 31st, 1964, but that's the title, obviously. It came out.
Oh, yeah.
Nope, he's not listed as a writer. Just an homage to him, I guess.
Well, he might have just been such a fan of it of the show that he wanted to be on it.
Well, now he wasn't on it. Well, he might have been now. Oh, see, did he cameo? What I remember about it was they did this whole thing and it was a horror episode of the show. And then at the end, right before he leaps, he finds out like one of the kids, it was like, oh, watch out, Stevie. And like the little kid walks up and you see the thing and like the last name is King and he's like, Boogada what? And then he leaps, right?
That's funny.
But now I'm thinking, like, did Stephen King, like, walk by as an extra or something in that one? Probably not. I'm just still thinking about Quantum Leap.
But yeah, so this last era, he's just writing more about human nature and people through the lens that's not strictly horror, right? It's supernatural fiction, it's suspense, it's crime solving, true crime. Like, he really, post of that car accident, really starts going more towards the nature of people than the nature of scary things and the scary thing about people. As the multiverse grows and the universe grows, those two prongs grow. This is now when you start to see things that are loosely based off of all of this Stephen King that has now existed for decades. You have the series Castle Rock on Hulu, which we mentioned before. There's a series coming out called Derry, which is Derry, Maine, which is where it takes place, right? And it's another neighbor to Castle Rock. So now this show Derry has this loose base, likely is going to visit Castle Rock, is going to visit Salem's Lot, is going to have some sort of mention of this giant, vast universe that's been created over the course of these decades.
So through those decades, like you're talking about, are the books rooted in time periods? Like obviously the Kennedy assassination one, like it has a date to it, but are they usually like pretty explicit about this takes place in 1988? Or do you figure that kind of stuff out based on the characters that will show up and you realize, oh, this character is older than they were a kid in Stand By Me, so this happens 10 years later? Like, do you have to figure that out? Or are they very grounded in real world time and therefore oh, well, we haven't seen this character since 1967 and here we are in 1982 kind of thing? So
from just the top of my head memory, he is usually pretty specific about time and place.
Okay.
And he's usually, his more famous books in each of these eras are taking place in the era they existed. They were written, right? I think about Holly, which came out in September, right? I was nerding out about it earlier this season. And at the end of last season, I'm like, it comes out in September. I can't wait for it to come out. It's very clear what point in time Holly takes place because Stephen King wrote it during the pandemic, if not just after, when things really started to reopen up. So the character goes through pandemic related things, and there's a lot about Trump being president. There's a lot about it's in that moment, Needful Things. He mentions the year a couple of times. Oh, it's 2000 or it's 1999, like whatever the year is, they are mentioning where it is. So when Ace Merrill pops up, he was a teenager in the 50s and now
30
he's
years
like an
ago,
older, so, or the 60s, I think is Stand By Me is supposed to take place. So he's very specific with time. I will say there are some books that are not as specific. There's the book he wrote recently called Fairy Tale. That's the other one I mentioned is really fantasy driven. I think that could take place any kind of relative to now time. There will definitely come a point in time where it's outdated because of the cell phone that the kid uses or whatever. But usually within his book, he's created that universe that he reverts to their memories. And as he's psychological suspense horror, supernatural horror, there's timelines and time frames. And then you extrapolate that out of the books. So I think because of that, he's generally pretty specific to an area of time.
And when he uses those characters, right? So you were saying like they'll show up in different books and this is how you realize everything is connected and there's a time period. So characters age and this kind of thing. Are they a foreshadowing element or a harbinger of something? Like when you're reading this book and a character from 3 books ago shows up, is that your clue that, oh, this is because it's this kind of supernatural thing? Or, oh, something really scary bad is about to happen now because this person walked through the scene? Like, is it built out like that?
I would say yes. And without coming up with specific examples, I'll go back to Ace Merrill in Needful Things. When he pops up, I had forgotten that his character popped back up. Right. Again, I read this when I was a teenager and loved it and never went back to it. And the movie was a flop. It was okay, but it just wasn't it. But so when Ace Merrill pops up to help out the bad guy, Leland Gaunt in this book, the proprietor of Needful Things who makes not great deals with people for the things that they want. When he comes in to help Leland Gaunt, you're like, oh boy, this is not good. This is not good for Ace Merrill. This is not good for the people of Castle Rock. Whatever Leland Gaunt has in mind at this point when Ace Merrill pops up, you know he's going to go and do some sleazy, dirty work for this guy, and he's going to get what he wants out of it, right? He's going to overtake the town of Castle Rock. Like, you know, it's a bad thing because of who he is. A lot of times there's references, right? Like, oh, that my teacher's so mean. She must have been bit by that dog Cujo I read about. Or like that kind of frames what you're supposed to think about that person. The references are never without reason. So there's always some sort of, did it tell me what I needed to know up to this point? Is it telling me something I need to know for the future? It could be either or both.
Do the bad guys do this? The bad guys do the evil entities or like the scary things, you know, do those pop up as well? Or is it usually like, oh, this was a character we got to know and they were a survivor of this book and now they've jumped across onto this other book? Or are there like overarching villains or powerful elements like that go
the
forward?
Dark Tower creates an overarching villain idea or overarching thing that drives the villains, the bad guys. You brought up an example of like someone who survived a thing in one other book and that person appears in this book. There's that. I don't know that there's an overarching villain at all. I don't think there's a singular bad guy that becomes a bad guy. Oh, I hope I get nerd corrected on this because I know there's something about the dark half that appears somewhere else, like a bad evil entity in the dark half that appears somewhere else. Maybe the Dark Tower, or the other way around. It appears in the Dark Tower and is what drives the dark half, is about a writer who goes mad. There's a bad guy overarching connection there, but overarching over the whole universe, no. Other than that, there's just evil in the world. Okay. And some places seem to be more evil than others, like Derry and Castle Rock and Salem's Lot.
Right. The hellmouth of all evil, Maine.
Right. It's the hellmouth idea, right?
Yeah.
Which is Santa Barbara.
The next thing on the notes are just the prevalence and influence on pop culture that these books have had. And I think like that is absolutely how I know about Stephen King. I've never read a Stephen King book, but I know of all these books because I've seen the Simpsons parodies and the movies that parody them and like all of these things. Like I know the plots of the stories of those super famous books because they're homaged and they're parodied and things so often.
And more off of the visual imagery in pop culture, right? The visual imagery of the movies. You see, I think we just recently had some commercial, like a newer commercial that parodied, Jack breaking down the door with the axe in The Shining. Right. And it's like they put through like a can of beer of Bud Light or something through the thing. Like it was something silly. There's so much visual imagery that exists because of the movies, whether they were hits or flops. That it's a thing, right? You see a girl in a white gown who's covered in red. What do you think of? You think of Carrie, right? So it's all of that. But I think of the show Derry that's coming out. which is a very specific nod. I think of Stranger Things.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Stranger Things, 100%, the writers of Stranger Things have said they've taken so much of that multiverse and universe that Stephen King created in the 80s to drive their storytelling in Stranger Things. Even the title card. I did a post when Stranger Things was brand new, and I put the font of Needful Things on the cover and the font of Stranger Things, and they're like identical.
Sure.
Right?
I
so
believe it. Yeah.
Those are the effects of pulp culture. There's just so much, and he's still writing, and the writing he's still doing is really good. I feel like, I've aged with him, right? Even though he's a bit older than both of us, his writing when I was young was scary. And gosh, I remember reading The Shining when I was taking a tour with a USC band through Spain. And we were staying in these hotels that were older than America. And one of them, I remember we just went exploring in the hotel during the siesta because we were wide awake and everyone else was like chilling. So we went through these like tunnels. Like I was in the middle of reading The Shining and I was scared out of my mind with some of these like old parts of these hotels that they don't use and underground things, and ended up in a ballroom. I'm like, no, I am not going in there at all. I'm turning around and going back. And then now writing, imagine Stephen King writing a book from the voice, first person of a girl named Holly. Like it's just, there's so much out there, and there's so much that pop culture references to. I think of it a little bit how you were saying, like 50 years from now, moral of stories will be told by Star Wars stories. I think 50, 100 years from now, morals of bad people doing bad things will be referenced through Stephen King.
Sure. Yeah, so, I agree with that. It is supremely prevalent. Everyone knows these stories, and everyone knows the name of Stephen King. What experience do you have with Joe Hill?
So it's funny because Joe Hill also wrote under a pseudonym to start because he didn't want anyone. Was it that, or did he just use the last name?
Joe Hill is the pseudonym, right?
Yes,
right.
That is the pseudonym. Yeah. Well, I think his name is Joe.
He's Joe King, but he goes under Joe Hill.
I think I have enjoyed everything I've read. Comic books, Lock and Key. Right?
Lock and Key was amazing. That's the experience I had. Yeah.
And he co-wrote one with his dad, which I thought was really cute. I read it. I liked it. It was okay. Not my favorite. But most books that Stephen King co-wrote, he's got like 3 or 4 that he's co-wrote with someone. They're not on the top of my Stephen King list anyways. I'm reading now, like on social media, people are like, oh, I didn't know that was his son. And I'm like, I've known for a very long time.
I mean, that's how it was introduced to me. Was, this is by Joe Hill. That's Stephen King's son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I enjoy his writing. I think if we plugged him in an era that we just talked about, it'd be this third era, right? He's writing a lot along the lines of what his dad is writing now. I think they're kind of in step together about how they're exploring human nature and supernatural horror, if you will, supernatural fiction.
So I imagine you are going to, if you're someone listening to this podcast, you want to get into Stephen King, or you're, recommending this to your friend, you're not going to start with like, just read them in chronological order that they came out, right? You want to do some recommendations of like, what's going to be a great modern story that's going to hook a reader into wanting to read more. What's your recommendations?
I actually get asked this a lot, and it depends on the person, but the angle I'm going to take with you as my best friend is that I usually tell people when they say, where do you recommend I start reading? Well, if you really like horror, read Carrie. It's phenomenal. Read it. It is scary as heck. The Shining. They're all really good reads. Salem's Lot. Man, Salem's Lot kept me awake when I was a teenager. Scared. But that's usually not where I start. If people are getting into Stephen King for the first time, I think the strongest thing I can say is you don't have to like the horror genre. You just have to be prepared to explore things that are scary. Sometimes can be gory a little bit, depending on the book. But I usually recommend, first and foremost, different seasons. Different seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall. 1 novella for each season. 3 of the 4 novellas have become movies, and 2 very popular pop culture movies. That's Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, becoming The Shawshank Redemption, and The Body, becoming Stand By Me. And I think most people, especially our age, have seen Stand By Me and either missed the title card that says written by Stephen King or based on a novella written by Stephen King, or they never paid attention that they missed it, or they just never realized it's the same Stephen King, I guess. So most people our age, especially, or if they, like I have a couple of friends our age who have teenagers. Oh, my kid's 15 and wants to start reading Stephen King. What do you reckon? Start here, because if they can handle these stories, they'll be able to handle anything that he reads. But so that's my first. Start with different seasons. If you are not sure about reading some of his thicker, bigger novels, his short story collections are fantastic, and they range of different genres throughout. So Skeleton Crew, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, Hearts in Atlantis, Four Past Midnight is also novellas instead of short stories, but these are shorter books and shorter things to read. He's coming out with a new collection. I'm very excited. I think in May he has a new collection of short stories coming out. The Green Mile was actually a series of short stories that he published like in a newspaper and then put it into a book format. So his short stories are really a good read. If you are the sci-fi, high fantasy area, definitely The Dark Tower and Fairy Tale and Eyes of the Dragon. There's some paranormal kind of things like Bag of Bones is really good, and it's scary, not clown in a ditch scary, but ghosts, and I don't want to give away the novel. It's really good. Then you have just what he's writing right now, the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. It's Mr. Mercedes, Finders Keepers, and End of Watch. And then characters in those show up in The Institute, which is a phenomenal book about kids with special powers that are in this institute, and they're figuring out who they are and why they're trapped in this place. You have The Outsider, which is, I mean, they made a show on Hulu that didn't capture just how scary The Outsider is. So this is this is closest, I think, to the It style, Shining style scary. The Outsider is there. And then Holly and crime stuff. Sorry, he's got a book called Joyland. He wrote like 3 short novels under this crime genre. I'm going to forget the names of the other. Oh, one's called Later. Really good. It's a little bit of Sixth Sense. Kid sees dead people, but not really sees them. He hears them. Really, talk about really cool universe to create. He has this young boy, 11-year-old or so. He can see and hear dead people for a span of time, and there's a set of rules, like when their voice starts to fade, they're going to what their next thing is, but it's a crime thing. So all of his present stuff I would read. And then of course your big time, I want to get scared out of my mind, you should be reading The Stand, The Shining, you should be reading It, you should be reading Misery, Carrie, throw in there Cujo. I didn't find Cujo scary as a book, but a lot of people did. I found it kind of silly, a dog with rabies who's possessed or whatever. Like I didn't buy into that, but there's just so much.
Pet Cemetery seems like a scarier.
Pet Cemetery was scarier than Cujo for sure, right? Misery was scarier than Cujo for me, and that's not even a scary evil clown. That's a person. If you ask me for my number 1 recommendation, try different seasons, depending on where you want to go from there.
And can we expect a formalized recommendation list in this upcoming Nerd Best Friends newsletter available on patreon.com?
100%, of course. Yes.
Perfect.
We're back at it again this week. Rob, what's the nerdiest thing you did this week?
Annalise, I made a mistake. I made a big mistake.
Oh boy.
I was, I signed up for this Instagram thing that was advertised. I made a mistake. I'm sure this is going to be a mistake, but I'm actually very excited about it. So I saw this thing. Right. It's like a Warhammer Citadel miniature subscription box thing.
Oh no.
So here's why it's cool. Every month or every 2 weeks, I'm going to get a delivery of Age of Sigmar, Warhammer, like fantasy stuff.
Okay.
Cancel anytime, it says. For the first month, I got 2 sets and of course introductory low price of like $7. So I'm already happy with the purchase that I'm getting because I got $7 worth of stuff. So what it comes with is a little tiny magazine, right?
Okay.
And it's definitely geared towards, like, you can tell this is geared towards kids, right? Like this is geared towards like your 12, 15-year-old of like, want to get into Warhammer? Start here in our easy, how to play tutorial kind of thing. But I love it because I think I like things that are well laid out and like thoughtful and really give you explanations of how this game works and this kind of thing. What's also interesting about this little magazine is it's 3-hole punched because one of these months, one of the things I'm going to get is a giant binder, so I can collect all of my little magazines in order with the dividers. And every month you get miniatures as well. So for the first one, I got like the Commander miniature for the Stormcast Eternals and a Commander miniature for the Orc War Boss guy that I'm going to be collecting. And in the second magazine, it came with like a whole sprue of 10 dudes to make and start building these armies. Cancel anytime, it says. But if I keep going, eventually, eventually, I will have 2 gigantic, complete, full Warhammer armies. All the paint that they say I need to paint them, the entire rule book, all this stuff, little by little, chunked out over probably the next 5 years of my life. I have no idea.
Oh my gosh.
Cancel anytime, it says.
Cancel anytime, but you're not gonna.
So we'll see how long. It just caught me just right. Like, oh, look at this little project. Look at this giant project, but that will be parsed out for me every couple of weeks. Here's a little chunk. Isn't this a little fun project? Here's another little chunk. Is this another little fun project? We'll see how far it goes before, like, basically what I'm thinking is, okay, this will be fun for a little while. Once it starts stacking up, once it gets behind and looks like, oh God, now it's a chore, I'll cancel it, right? It looked fun. And I got my package for my first 2 weeks, and I'm looking through the little magazine, and it's got all kinds of cool art and like very introductory, like here's how to play. You roll the dice, and it gives you even like you can put your little dice on the page in little squares to like try to. It's
Nudie Magazine Day.
It totally feels that way. I'm jumping up and down like, it's Stormbringers Day. I got my Stormbringers box. So it's a little subscription box. It's got miniatures in it. It's got game rules and stuff. And it's definitely, I'm satisfied with the way it's paced out as far as like, this is bare bones beginner. Build this. You can play with them right away. Next month, we're going to send you some more. Here's another way to play with like another rule attached, because now you have more than one thing. The next one that comes is going to have paint with it. And so it'll be all about like a little paint tutorial. Like I said, it would be great for kids or for, you know, your older child or somebody who's just wants to get into wargaming and wants to learn how to paint miniatures and build an army and stuff like that. I feel like it is very successful in that. And for me, it's just, like you said, it's Nudie Magazine Day. Every month I'm going to get this little box and I'm going to get all excited and I'm going to, take my little nippers and I'm going to cut out my models and glue my fingers to them. And then we'll see how far we get.
Talk about the algorithm just nailing it, because that has to be like, you got to be in the pocket. I don't know that I agree that it's for kids who are just starting out in Warhammer, because theoretically you're going to be months and months and months and months before you have an army big enough to play, right?
True. Although the way it's set up is like you build this guy and this guy and it teaches you how to
play each other. Okay,
and then you build this guy and this 10 guys and then it teaches you how to play with that much.
Gotcha. So it builds you up, because I'm thinking like you have to wait a certain point to get all the things in order to play this army. But okay,
that's what's smart about this is you can play with what's in each box.
Okay, so that's kind of cool.
That's the idea. And you're right. It's not really like I say it's for kids just because it's like that's what I would think of. It's like, well, I don't want to like overwhelm somebody with. So you want to play a Warhammer? Well, guess what? You need $5,000 and 100,000 hours of painting time, and you're gonna lose. Right. And by the time you're done, the new edition's gonna come out. You're gonna have to throw it. Like, you know what I mean? This is like it's a fun way to. I'll just go as long as it's fun, and then we'll see. Or I'll get that completionist part of me and be like, well, I have to finish this binder, so I guess I'm in it for another 3 years. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see where I'm at. But yeah, talk about that algorithm. It's like, oh, it's after Christmas. You just finished a bunch of painting projects. Your Trello board is clear for only $7.99. Here's a brand new, colorful, shiny, fancy project for you.
This is amazing. This is everything I ever wanted.
Yep. So it arrived this week and I tore into it and I built up the first models. Actually, once we're finished recording, I'm going to run outside and spray them with with the little sunshine we got left in the afternoon. Yeah, we'll see. I'll keep you posted on my,
can't wait to see
on my
more
Stormbringer progress.
Wonderful. Good job, Instagram algorithm. No, that sounds really cool.
I'm such a nerd. Tell me about your nerdiest league this week.
Before the year ended, I completed my mini painting goal. It was on average, 1 a week, 52 for the year. I had a chunk of time that I didn't paint at all. So of course, during winter break, I doubled down and took some chunks of time in painting, which meant I actually finished painting all of Series 2 of Final Girl. Mm-hmm. So the Series 3 Kickstarter ended earlier this season. and that'll be coming, I don't know, a year from now or so. But I hadn't played any of Series 2 because I hadn't painted them, and that's, the house rule I inherited from you. Painted them, finished that goal. Happy New Year. We're started back up and everything's, back at work and all those good things. One thing I hadn't done was varnish them. So I had to wait for a sunny day to varnish them. And that happened this week. So they sat in a box.
That's funny. I did the same thing. I had just sunny day, 100 sitting here waiting to be varnished. Yeah.
Just had my box waiting to be varnished and then varnished them all. And then I know I've talked about it before, but one thing I'm just going to shout out to Van Ryder Games for the way they created this series box where each story has a location and a killer, and they are interchangeable. It's done with magnets, and maybe I'll make a video or go like Instagram live to show this really creative way they have storing all the pieces. I hadn't even gone in to sleeve the cards yet. I hadn't gone in to set up. And so I spent some time this week pulling out this storyline, opening up one side. This is sleeving all of the cards. And then this is the killer side. So I'm going to put the killer mini and all the little chits that go and extra things extra meeples that go with this character. Then flip to the other side. And here's the location. So let me put the vehicle that I painted and the chits and sleeve the cards. And I did that. So Series 2 is all set up. That was all prefaced by making sure that I not only received the North Pole Nightmare Special Edition from Van Ryder Games, painted it and played it before Christmas, and then finished setting up the rest of Series 2. So I got to play it. I got to set up the series. Shelf looks really good with those two boxes. Let's see if I scooch over. Side by side, they actually
those are big boxes.
They made the boxes so that they are continuous.
Yep,
right. So it's really cool. So I got to do all that. And I like, it's just the organizational part of the brain, like putting the things in the sleeves and setting up the things so that when I pull out that game to play, I can pull one out and it's ready to go. So it's ready to go. And I got to play some.
That is key. There's definitely times where somebody will say, oh, we should play such and such. And and my face just drops because I know how long it's going to take me to like dig it out of the closet and find the terrain that's in a different place. And oh, did I finish painting that one part that we were waiting for on the like having your stuff organized and having that good like mental inventory of like everything is in its place, everything is ready to go is so important.
Sometime in I think November, it might have been a Black Friday sale with Sleeve Kings or Miniature Mart. I can't remember what, but you alerted me to it.
I think they do like Kickstarters every season, and it's like I don't know that they're making anything new or if they're just doing a new production, but they offer great prices on their
You'd offered me the Kickstarter. I did not do that. It was, I want to say it was like a Black Friday sale in November. So then I went and did the work to look up all the different games that I had that still needed to be sleeved. And I just had a drawer of sleeves. So it was also cool to pull those out and actually put my money to use by sleeving my games and just that organizational piece to it. But in particular with Final Girl and then playing, and I still have a blast playing this game. The North Pole Nightmare was just genius. I'll put some pictures up on our Instagram of me playing it. You had made little presents for me because Krampus drops a present each one of his turns.
Yeah, we did a little 3D printed presents.
So it turned out great. So that was the nerdiest thing I did this week, was organizational nerded out for Final Girl, and then got to play it and included North Pole Nightmares. This is so much fun.
How fun. Mrs. Claus is the final girl, and that blew me away when you shared that. Yes. Like, oh my God, how clever. That's funny.
Because awesome. The location for North Pole Nightmares is the North Pole. Sure. And you have a Comet, one of the reindeer. Comet's there that you can pick up as a vehicle and ride him around faster to escape Krampus. The little meeples. Someone on the Facebook group showed they like from Etsy bought little meeples that looked like elves, because in North Pole Nightmare your victims are elves who are running around North Pole trying to not get killed. They're also mischievous. The elves open presents, and if it's a good present they keep it for themselves, and if it's a bad present you get the effects of whatever the bad present is. Yeah, so you can play Mrs. Claus. Her little mini is carrying like a big giant rolling pin in one hand. It's so hilarious. And then there's also an elf. There's an elf as the other final girl. I haven't played the elf yet.
It sounds like it's fun, but it sounds like the people, like, it sounds like when they made it, like, it sounds like, oh, they were having a really good time making this game.
I appreciate that the makers of the game are also horror genre nerds.
Mhm.
And they even put in their, like, the end of all of their posts, like Kickstarter posts and stuff. It's like, what horror movie are you watching this week? And they'll talk about the things they're reading and watching, kind of like we do with the nerdiest thing you did this week. They do it with just horror films. I think they have a blast making these and playing them because it's such a fun game. It is such
Very
a fun
cool.
game.
Next time on Nerd Best Friends, we're launching an epic new series, The 30s. Travel back in time with us to 1994, a golden year of geek culture. We'll dive deep into movies, comics, games, and the tech that defined that era, all from our nerd perspective. It's a nostalgia trip 30 years in the making.
Oh man, that's going to be so much fun.
I'm really excited about this idea. I think it's going to be fun. We're going to look at our, the different movies that came out 30 years ago, music, comic books. And it's fun because, like, we were in high school in 1994.
Yeah.
This is going to be just awesome. If you want to keep up to date on Nerd Best Friends, hit that subscribe or follow button on your device. We appreciate our fans, especially the ones that share our podcast with others and give us that 5-star rating wherever they get their podcasts. We are at Nerd Best Friends on social medias, and you can send us a message through podcast@nerdbestfriends.com. These are the best and easiest ways to grow our nerd family.
Well, thanks for riding along this Stephen King journey, Rob. I am going to get you to read at least a book, at least one.
I'm paying it forward because at least next season, we're going to start this Lord of the Rings thing. And so I will do my duty because I know that I will be asking a lot as well in the near future as we get into that. That's my ace in the hole. Always fun to talk to you, Analese. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Wow, Rob. Wow.
It's been a month since we've recorded, so.
Yeah, let's pretend that's the excuse. Rose, can you wait? Yes.
Wait, there you are. Stop recording.